Okay. So we start off. So we've got Will Page here. Will used to be chief economist at Spotify, and recently has started writing his own book. And maybe Will, you can talk about that in a moment. And then Marina here from The Economist, managing director and EVP of circulation. The last time we had a event here at the Ministry, Marina was here on the panel as well, so sort of it's a bit of a running theme there. But maybe if you both want to just spend a couple of minutes telling the audience a bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, Marina Hayden, I'm Managing Director of Circulation for The Economist. That means my role is basically to look after the readership business and ensure that we can be as effective as possible in driving reader revenue growth. You can't talk about reader revenue growth without talking about delivering customer value in some way, shape, or form. So really pleased to be here this evening to latch on to a couple of those themes that were mentioned in Carol's earlier presentation.
Will Page, former chief economist at Spotify, and then prior to that, PRS for music, and embarked on the journey of writing a book to be published by Simon & Schuster in the UK, Little Brown in the US. For anyone contemplating writing a book, the best description I can have, it's like playing tennis with yourself. So you're locked up in the British Library between 9 and 5 every day and nobody to share your ideas with. So it's great to have some social life and people with pulses here. But yeah, just to also add to that, attention's been a fascination of mine. Really compliment the work that MIDiA is doing. Not enough attention is paid to attention, pun intended. And it's also going to be a key chapter of the whole book as well. So it's great to be able to share some of that work here on stage.
My job for the next few minutes is to try to see if I can sort of play you two off each other a little bit. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is one of the things that Spotify really focused on was this idea of demand creation. You know, you create markets, you create behaviors which didn't exist before. You get people to consume in a way that they didn't. And you know, in some ways that can be as Carol was talking about earlier on, there can be a misalignment about what the audience wants and what the platform wants. You know, because a platform wants as many people as possible spending as much amount of time and doesn't necessarily be as concerned about the audience getting exactly what they want, getting it in the right way, really enjoying it, getting the right things for them rather than necessarily the thing that just makes them spend more time there. And when you take that out of the context, you know, into the broader digital landscape, you get, you know, how many of us who spend our time going on some sort of website somewhere or another, and there'll be all of this bottom feeder clickbait at the bottom saying stories recommended for you, delivered by, you know, companies like Taboola and Outbrain. That has become the zenith of this idea of just try to get as many people to spend as much time as possible. You give them clickbait, you give them really sort of almost like the fast food of content. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got The Economist, which is sticking incredibly true to your principle of serving higher quality content to, you know, an engaged and discerning audience, and fighting some, you know, really hard battles to stay true to, you know, to what you do. So I guess why I'm getting to do this with this is the peak in the attention economy just an unintended consequence of demand creation? You know, trying to create all of this demand for people to do stuff, and we just end up, it's the same way as you let a teenage kid do exactly what they want, they're not going to end up in a very good shape in a couple of years. You have to parent them. And it's maybe the same thing has happened with the digital content economy, that actually letting consumers run by just saying, we're just going to feed you loads more. Here's more, here's more, here's more. They don't know when to stop. So
to try and bolt in some economics early into the conversation here, what I would encourage the audience, the panel, to think about here is the concept of the tragedy of the commons. So that's a scarce good that's non-excludable. You can't prevent people from getting to it, and if I get it, it means you can't. Coming from a fishing village in Scotland, North Sea fish stocks, classic example. Everybody overfished the North Sea, and as a result, we have a tragedy of the commons. There's no more fish stocks left. And I think that's the interesting thing to approach attention with, which is everybody wants more of it, but they don't care about anybody else's actions. So you're clickbaiting, and I'm clickbaiting, all for that scarce resource. And that's a useful sort of platform to kick off with in terms of like what's actually happening here in the economics of attention.
I think that this is partially really driven by the technical requirements of getting people hooked to digital products. So don't know how many of you have read Nir Eyal's book called Hooked. 5 years later, he's now written a book which is called basically Undistractable, which means that digital subscription providers and digital products have gotten really good at latching and placing triggers that have actually been controlling us more than we have actually been making conscious decisions about our own behavior. And I think this is a fundamental shift. From the perspective of the news media industry, we as a category used to have a monopoly over people's time at certain parts of the day. People would be watching the evening news because that was actually one of the few things that people would do. People would be reading a newspaper in the morning because that actually became sort of a normal cultural ritual that was common in certain types of households. And these let's say, rituals which have become a little bit more conscious have been replaced by basically by mobile-driven attention consumption across a whole variety of product streams, where we are fed hooks and triggers to consistently be distracted. So I think we're actually operating in the peak distraction economy rather than the peak attention economy, because we have very, very little attention left because we're constantly being distracted. That's our challenge, is to deal with a new set of people that are constantly distracting or distracted.
So, Will, just pulling that into the context of music playlists, one of the things that we know is that more people are spending more time listening to playlists. It might not yet be at the scale for music that binge watching is, for example, for video, but nonetheless they're spending more time there. One of the things Carol was talking about is the difficulty of separating out what is attention versus sentiment, i.e., if people are spending a lot of time listening to a playlist that is in similar ways, in a similar ethos to clickbait, which is making sure that they're listening to something which isn't going to make them turn off, which isn't necessarily the same as making them listen to something that they love. And you can end up with a lot of your time saying, yeah, it's okay. You know, and we'll walk into a bit later about the difference between discovery and, you know, and actually hearing and seeing new stuff. But do you think there is a risk at some stage that playlisting strategy, curated playlisting strategy as it stands, you know, across all platforms, could result in more people essentially getting to the point saying, well, time is scarce, I'm not actually getting that much new music I really want to hear, maybe I'll shift some of my time elsewhere?
No, I think with playlisting strategy, what I think is interesting there is you've got a situation where for the first time in a long time, there's more revenues going into the business. So the music industry is increasing in its revenues, but it may be decreasing in its relevance because the playlist just becomes much more like a wallpaper. That is not to the detriment of the music industry, it's a success, but it's, you know, could anyone in this room tell me who's number one in the charts this week? Probably not. You know, the intimacy factor in music has perhaps taken a back seat as curation has taken a front seat. And when we say, I want to get as much time as possible, just to be clear on that point, you want as much time consuming music as possible. I could spend 2 hours on an app, music, publication, video streaming, trying to find what I looking for. That's attention, but it's bad attention paid. So there's good and bad forms of attention that could be paid to an app experience as well. So if I'm just going to Discover Weekly, then, you know, that's taken the weight of choice off my shoulders, which allows me more time to get into the consumption side. So it's really important to capture that trade-off of not all time spent should be treated the same, essentially.
Yeah. So, Rick, I'm going to come to you with a question, but I'm going to frame it from a music industry perspective, which is, and actually, before I do that, you're going to have to do a quick intro of yourself, which everybody already did that. So here's the launch pad for it. So Will was talking about how some of the intimacy has gone from music. And, you know, there was a brilliant piece from a Pitchfork journalist, who I can't remember, he said streaming had left a hole in his musical soul. You know, there was just something about that, you know, the passion that, you know, and the whole thing about being a music fan, and that has sort of been almost like music. A lot of people said about 20 years ago, music's going to become like water. And you know what? It has become like water, but that's not a good thing. Now, how many of us, when we go out for a drink, talk about how great that stuff is that comes up our tap when we turn it on? We don't. If it gets turned off, we'd be worried about it, but it's just become a thing that's there. And there's a risk that music has just become a thing that's there for a lot of people. things that got us thinking about the attention of Kohonu years ago, we're seeing that a lot of the casual mobile gamers were beginning to drift out of the market. And so it seems that beyond the casual gamers, games has done a really good job of still making the core gamers absolutely passionate and absolutely engaged, and seems to put a lot of effort into doing that as well. Is that a fair observation or not?
And I'm so sorry I'm late, everybody. My name's Rick Gibson. I'm the chief executive of the BGI, which is a new charity for games culture, but I moonlight as a consultant and have been a games analyst since the early 2000s. So I think I would answer that question in a slightly unusual way, in that saying that the amount of time that consumers spend in apps isn't particularly interesting to games companies. It's not the main metric that they're following, because even if the data is correct that the number of people or the amount of time that people spend playing games is falling gradually, what you've seen over the last 3 years is that the amount of money that they're spending has increased by nearly 50%, and so. Really, games companies are not interested in binge watching, in grabbing eyeballs and keeping them inside their apps, because even if that 74% of mobile expenditure is in games, 33% of downloads. Games companies aren't interested in the fact that about 10% of time spent in app is taken by games, and that's because the games industry has focused on how to engage with their consumer, how to understand value, and to a level that I think many don't really appreciate. So I remember 20 years ago when free first started to come out of Asia, and the games industry was very defensive about it in the West, because they thought, hold on, you're taking all of our money. We can't give our stuff away for free. Nowadays, the games industry grows at between 9 and 12% every year, and has done and will do for this foreseeable future. Now, free is worth nearly $90 billion to games companies these days. Now, put that in context, only 1.6 to about 2%, depending on which platform you look at, of players actually buy stuff. So the dividend that you get from opening up your content for free, but then finding ways to engage with your audience, to optimize that experience using data, and then to find out what those consumers value, that is the science and the art at the heart of most successful, particularly mobile games companies, but many others.
Which is the games industry has done an amazing job of monetizing its most valuable customers, its whales. The music industry, a recorded music industry, has less of an ability to do that because everybody's paying the same amount of money. So what can record labels and other music industry companies learn from games?
So I suppose there's two ways of looking at this. One is from the company perspective, which is that the primary lesson for games companies, particularly mobile, but increasingly across all of the games platforms, is know your customer. Break your product up into small pieces and figure out exactly what is valued by whom. Split test the hell out of everything. And that's the methodology where you might put in front of two customers who are seeing the same game, they might see different colors. And you're looking at the data probably on a day-to-day basis, and then you're deciding which one is converting better. So if you imagine the funnel from somebody seeing an ad for your game, all the way through to purchase, all the way through to the end of the lifetime value of that customer and how much money they spend, that funnel is something that games companies focus on, and there are dedicated data scientists within games companies who are looking just at that data, and then they're optimizing. So what that means is that in front of a live audience, you are changing your product. Yeah. So there's a very granular process of metrics that you're using to create your products. But the other thing is that because free came out of Asia 20 years ago, the customer has been educated. So games players now, anyone who started playing from the mid-90s onwards, is going to see freemium and free play as just standard. And they will get used to incredibly complex mechanics inside of games. So there are many games that have multiple different virtual currencies with which you can purchase different kinds of things in the game. Some of them you might buy, some of them you might earn, some of them a bit of both. But customers are not fazed by this because they've been learning over 20 years that's how you play these kinds of games. Yeah. So there is a customer education track that you need to take your customers down that will take time. So as you experiment, they come to know what you can provide to them and value it.
I think the fundamental difference in this equation is the games publishers have way more control over their audience and way more of a direct relationship with their audience, and they're not their platforms, but they have a platform-like role because of how much data they see and how much control of and that is that you have obviously a very different setup of music where the platform and the rights holders are very separate, but it's more similar to the role of the Economist. Now, I'm interested in, there's obviously right across digital news, there's been a lot of experimentation around pricing and product, over the years, and I don't think we're there yet in working out, exactly what the right mix is. Within this context of attention becoming scarce and you have to earn the time of your audience, how do you balance out that idea of what to charge people, the need to charge people, but making sure that you're delivering something that they feel warrants the fee, and how do you work out what the right way is to charge them?
Well, the simple answer to that question is conduct a lot of research, which we recently have done. Pricing has been a core part of our revenue growth success story. So we have been able to double our circulation contribution over the past 5 years through a mix of doing not only price, but also increasing levels of marketing investment, keeping an active presence on social media, and basically leveraging a full digital ecosystem to ensure that we reach as many people as possible with our content through a sophisticated content marketing program, and by investing in digital product development. So do customer research to understand how strong is your pricing power. If you discover it is strong, as that was what we discovered, we then developed a pricing strategy that correlates with the strong pricing power that The Economist has, and we increase price. So our prices have gone up by 20% this March, and our last significant price increase was 3 years ago, where we were also increasing to similar levels. But you cannot rely only on price, and that has been the failing, I don't want to say failing, but just the struggle of a number of publishers that are simply looking for ways to increase their reader revenue stream while their advertising model is also under pressure. I mean, we have to basically say that the media industry in this digital subscription economy is the industry which has been most disrupted and most challenged over the last 10 years, although actually, well, music was also pretty challenged, but we within the media industry like to think it's us. And these number of pressures on the business model from multiple sides means that getting the right pricing and marketing strategy, of course, is quintessential. And you cannot only rely on price among your existing readers, but you need to be winning new customers and then developing digital products with which that new type of customer is going to be engaging with you regularly and creating a value proposition around that.
So I want to build on that with something that Rick touched on, which is this idea of getting better at monetizing a smaller audience. Now, you've explained it in a really positive way with games, where people are given more reasons to spend more, and they're actively doing so because they're positively engaged with the games. If you look in the TV sector, in traditional TV, we know that Netflix and everyone else is stealing all of the subscribers, and they're losing subscribers, but they've got more revenue than ever before because they're making the people who've got left spend more by selling them more broadband and more telephony. And that is a very different way of making more money out of a smaller customer base. It's squeezing every last dreg that you can get out of it. And that is generally an older user base that's eventually going to literally die off. And so what sits in the middle? Because it's not as easy for music or even news to do what games does, because the game is a scarce entity, right? That gameplay only exists in that one game. And if you want to unlock the power up or whatever it is, you can only do it there. The song is available everywhere. The story is available everywhere. Now, you could say that with a slight nuance with news is the way it is written and the editorial and the context, that's important. And in streaming, we'd say, well, the programming and the curation that goes around it. But fundamentally, news and music are ubiquitous and gameplay is scarce. So what are the ways that, either music or news, and anyone can answer this question, what are the ways it can build a way of getting people to spend, of course, more on something they don't need to spend? How do you do it? In the same ways we're talking about earning attention, how do you earn the right to make people want to pay more?
I make 2 points on this. Firstly, in terms of pricing strategy of The Economist, one big distinction with how your business works versus ours is if I pay for The Economist, which I've done since before being a teenager, I still get hit with adverts, which is very interesting. In fact, if I pay for The Economist, physical and app, I get hit with adverts twice, with twice as many impressions. Whereas in music, we say if you pay, we forego the experience to generate advertising revenue. That's an interesting dynamic. If we take that to video streaming versus broadcast television, I'm applying attention economics here. I might give you an hour of my time, but 25% is soaked up with adverts. Now I'm willing to pay Netflix to have an hour soaked up with TV content instead. You see imposing the constraint and then looking at the allocation there. That's a really, really important point to apply there. Now, in terms of where it could go next, to echo everything that you've just said, I think you learn a lot from the gaming industry. The thing for me to get into is contestability. If I'm reading The Economist, there's very little else I can do with my time. But if I listen to it, which you've now made that feature available for a few years now, it frees up the ability to do something else with my time. Now, forget money, RPU, dwell time from an attention perspective. That's a more efficient use of my attention, and that will keep me as a subscriber of your publication. But in your industry, for people in the game industry, you probably know the name Chris Deering very well, but he made this fascinating point about games. We're 10 times the size of music, never focused on monetization, only ever focused on engagement. And he made this point about the gaming industry is looking at the smart speaker opportunity as how can we play games that don't involve our hands? And the penny dropped for me. Bingo. The restriction on games is I have to use these things. If I didn't use these things, I could do something else with my time. And again, your business is well placed to make a better use of people's attention. So I just think the games industry is just moving so much faster than all the other sort of pieces of the media jigsaw. Think about that for a second. A gaming industry which doesn't require hands, that could be your next chapter.
And there are a few companies that are looking at that I know. What I would add is that there's a constant experimentation with commercial models that goes on in games, and we've been talking really only about a couple in other media. Whereas if you look at a standard freemium game, you will find that there are elements of subscription. So there might be micro subscriptions that you can access for a certain amount of time when you spend money. There might be elements of scarce items that you only get for a certain amount of time that therefore increase the perceived value for the player, and therefore they will buy them. With a microtransaction, it could be 49 pence or 99 pence. You could be buying a bundle of those pieces of content that come out in future because you enjoyed the first couple and you can see, I could get 15 for the price of 10. So I mean, that's just a few examples. Then, of course, there are those that get more controversial, where you're using chance and the elements of that are often found in gambling without taking any money out of the game, but you're being encouraged to buy stuff that you could get something amazing, or it might end up being rubbish. And so there's a huge amount of experimentation with multiple different commercial models that's happening at the same time. And I would point out that kind of experimentation isn't just in mobile games. You're also finding it in the premium product. So there is a significant chunk of the games industry that's on consoles, which are typically rather like an old MIDiA product being sold once. But then once you've bought it, there's a whole load of add-ons that you can buy, which also will sell you individual items. They might have opportunities to move you forward in a game. They might be about how you are perceived in the game, in a social environment, a cosmetic item that simply changes what you look like. So even the premium products are starting to adopt some of the free commercial models, and I think it's down to experimentation.
Why do you think they've gone that route? What's driven them there?
In terms of why the console games companies started to adopt that.
Yeah,
because it's so lucrative.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Grand Theft Auto, released 4 years ago, and it still makes $500 million a year from selling items and other services to players who bought the game years ago.
So to put a cynical...
Greatest Scottish export we've ever had.
Absolutely, yeah.
To
And the best-selling entertainment product of all time, and made in the UK.
Yeah. So to put a slightly cynical view on it, though, is when you compare and contrast it with how artists and labels monetize music fans, okay, there's a degree of fleecing that happens with live music, particularly in the larger venues, and secondary ticketing becoming less of an issue nowadays, but it's still, a big issue. But generally speaking, it would be hard to say that $9.99 is overcharging for all the music in the world on demand. What you're explaining is saying, well, so you've talked about how games has done a really good job of monetizing a core user base and getting good at extracting more money from them. The console manufacturers are saying, let's see how we can make even more money because we can. And that is sort of, the big difference between, sort of Marina's like fighting with Will about who was the first canary to die in the mine in the, the onslaught of digital. There's a genuine, really important sort of essence of what it means to be somebody in news, somebody in music, which is you've been brutalized by a decade and a half of decline. You treat your customers with reverence that they might go tomorrow, and I've got to do it, whereas games has never had that problem. Do you think the time could come where actually, with all the focus on everything we've been speaking about with the attention economy, etc., could we get to a stage where actually games companies might start having to not take the customers for granted anymore and be focusing less on how do we make more money, and actually those other metrics which you say games don't pay attention to as much, how much time are they spending, those things become more important. Fundamentally, can games do what they do because they're doing it from a position of comfort where there hasn't been a disruption yet?
So I'd take issue with the way you're characterising that, because I think it's too negative. What I would say is that games companies understand what their customers value and they provide more of that. If people did not value the services they were getting in games, they wouldn't buy them. They would leave. And games players are fickle and they will go. So what games companies have figured out, I mean, I'm banging this drum repeatedly, is how to engage with customers to figure out what does that customer value, down to a really micro-targeting level, that there are segments within segments within segments that are interested in that particular service or that particular product or that feature. And what you're doing is you're super serving. You're not exploiting. Although I can see how you could tip that over if you're too commercially aggressive, but I think that they're really providing huge amounts of value to players. And just to take your music analogy, I went to a concert last week, and I not only did I pay to go into the concert, I bought the merchandise, and then I bought a live CD that was mixed on the spot, and that was sent to me as a digital file an hour after I got home. So I was upsold a whole load of stuff. Now, you could say that band and their management and their record label were exploiting me. I don't think that. As a consumer, I'm thinking I've got my Snarky Puppy gig, I've got my Snarky Puppy t-shirt, and I've got my Snarky Puppy live CD that only an hour ago I was listening to. That's value to me, and I will pay whatever. The total value, I probably spent 90 quid that night on something that I valued. Now, there are games customers are doing the same.
Okay, good, well defended. But ultimately, any type of monetization is about exploitation, right? You exploit people's interests, you exploit that, and so it's not inherently a bad thing to be doing. It's business. But I want to change the conversation slightly as we're sort of bringing this into the home straight. Is tying it back very much to the essence of the attention economy. Is discovery has been this big, guiding light of so much of digital content. And there is a risk that we're overdoing discovery to such an extent that people aren't really discovering, right? So we're putting lots of content in front of people, but we're not necessarily discovering it. You know, so music is the easiest way to explain this. When you hear songs on the radio, the DJ often tells you who it is, and you'll have to hear it again and again for anybody who still listens to radio, but that's how things used to work. And in a streaming service, we might get 60 songs blasted past us, and 2 or 3 are good enough for us to go, yeah, add to collection, and the rest we might never hear again. We've heard 60 songs, but we haven't discovered 60 songs. Now, if we'd had them played again and again, and if we'd had someone tell us who they were, then maybe a few more of those songs we would have gone and genuinely discovered. You know, when we're looking at the movies and TV shows that are surfaced to us on our video services, etc., there's a lot there which just flies past us. I'm wondering whether news is a bit different, because I remember years and years ago when we first started seeing Facebook and Google putting themselves as the place between the audience and the news. It felt like the audience's relationship was now becoming with the story rather than with the news outlet. And so news outlets have had to do a huge amount of work into trying to establish their identity in a digital sense about, you know, and The Economist is a really good example. You take your objective, but you have really clear opinions on things, and that is why people read what you do. So I guess I want to open with, has discovery been a problem for news in the way that it has been a problem or a challenge met, depending on how you view it, for many of the other media industries?
So I'll take that discovery question in 2 parts. The first part is just discovering a news brand in principle and how you can make people familiar with the type of content that you serve. And the second part of the question is how do you make it easier for people that are in your ecosystem to discover the content that is most relevant to them? So I'll start with the second part of the question, because this is the one that is sort of keeping me awake at night, if you will. The Economist has been around for 176 years now. We've been regularly consuming or running consumer research. I don't know what we did 50 years ago, but I can say throughout my career at The Economist that the first time we started to see the theme content overwhelm come out in our consumer research was about 8 years ago. And that theme has been, just becoming more and more of an issue. And The Economist has been basically producing similar amounts of content, certainly in the weekly package that we provide, now augmented with different formats, as in you can listen to the audio edition, we have a daily app, but it's not us that's overwhelming our customers with content. Our customers are coming to us overwhelmed. To close the loop on the discovery question here, we need to make it really easy for the customer to have the sense that they're finding the content that is most relevant to them as early as possible in their journey, and also getting it as frequently as possible throughout the course of the week. So we have to be doing sort of what the gaming industry is doing, really listening to our customers, make sure we're feeding them at the right points in time in the digital product experience that we're having with them, to make sure that we can sort of flow above that noise and help them have the sense that it's easy to navigate The Economist for them. To the point, how does news itself sort of float above all the other distractions, from your messaging apps to your social apps, etc. I think, for us, the answer has been to ensure that we're really providing content which is of relevance to people at a particularly important point of time. I think it is getting harder, and publishers and all organizations operating in these types of ecosystems need to make conscious decisions about how much do they invest in marketing to be able to reach these prospects and really close the loop, because it's harder and harder to get people's attention regardless.
Will?
Just back onto the first point I said about the tragedy of the commons, or to quote Herbert Simon, a wealth of information leads to a poverty of attention. What's interesting there is how you describe consumers are feeling overwhelmed by content, so the strategy is compete for more of that attention, which would be the same strategy of the Financial Times and many substitutional products to bring contestability back into it. But just to underline that point, there's only so many hours in a day and we're competing for more and more of it. Something somewhere has to give. Maybe if I could ask one question, which I believe has been the secret to the success of The Economist, and I want it to be taken seriously, but I was told that a lot of the user testing for the Economist app was people sitting on the toilet. Is that correct? I'm not taking the piss here, so I did. But, no, is that true?
We've done.
You weren't part of the focus group, correct?
We've done a lot of serious user testing, and users.
Not video, I hope.
No. And people, yes, have told us about their experiences, and there are a range of content. Let's say location preferences. Some people like to read The Economist before they go to bed. Others do like to read it on the toilet. Yes, that is a habit as well. Others read it on their, on their commute, wherever. And it's about being able to slot into those important moments in the day. But we did not ask our customers to test on the toilet, but some of them did tell us that that is where they like to read The Economist. So be it.
Right. I can try to remember what the question was.
Discoverability.
Yeah, exactly. So Games has done a great job of being able to surface content, I don't think there are many gamers who would say they don't know what games to play, right? And it's so
discoverability is a massive problem in my sector. The cost of user acquisition is going up through the roof, really. And if your UA costs go too high above your LTV, then that's it. You stop.
But does that equally apply across all platforms, or is that more of a mobile issue?
It's a mobile and a PC thing. So Steam, the biggest PC games market, is filled with thousands and thousands of games. I mean, hundreds launch each week. So discoverability, I mean, it's easy for me to talk about how the games industry is this big and it's doing this well and it does this so well, but the reality is that, particularly for British companies, where they struggle to raise finance, is that you need a really serious war chest, not just to build good content and then to run it as a service, but also to go and actually buy your users. So that discoverability problem exists for games massively.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was fairly early on in the mobile games economy when you started having the big games publishers spending literally millions every day on acquisition.
Yeah, absolutely. But then they're making 3 times that. Their advertising spend will be on their revenue.
So I'm going to move it to questions in a moment. But first, one of the things, if I'm ever on a panel, one of the things that often frustrates me is, oh, yes, but I wanted to say. So there's a huge amount of stuff we could have covered, which we didn't. So I want to give the panelists each a chance to say, what's the thing you wish you could have spoken about, but we didn't? Marina?
Well, it certainly wasn't about reading The Economist on the toilet, I have to say that. I think it's a little bit more about the theme of just establishing customer value, and that in this theme of the attention economy, it's actually becoming harder and harder to even discern what is valuable to customers, and how do you also communicate about a real benefit-led product experience in this I don't want to say confused world, but fragmented world. And I think the challenge, and certainly for us, is about how segmentation is a challenge and an opportunity at the same time. But if you're crafting different messages for your entirety of let's say a range of possible types of readers, how does a brand actually stand up and say this is what we stand for if you are focusing on messaging that is going to sound right to a certain type of person. So I think that's also a challenge, is marketing to the individual when it actually is very important to hold on to a brand strength and stay very true to a core of your product.
Will?
2 very quick points. One, just bridging back into The Economist, I think it's fascinating to think about the pent-up demand that readers have for your publication, which is that Friday when it comes out, that Saturday morning where you clear your diary to digest in full, is very different from how other news outlets work. That's my space to digest that work. I'm allocating you a monopoly on my time, monopoly on my attention to. And that's an interesting thing in terms of where you go going forward, in terms of, do you play the clickbait game and try and get all your attention all the time, or do you shore up that position of Saturday morning, read The Economist cover to cover, and then go about your day? Discover Weekly had a similar thing. Like Discover Weekly used to peak at 4:15 in your Monday afternoon in every time zone that we had. Regardless, you did your meetings, you did your calls, and you zoned out with Discover Weekly at the end of the day. And then at 8:20 on a Sunday evening, you saw people going back in to save songs that they discovered. So there's a routine to how it grabbed your attention. And I think that's an interesting area. And then just to come back onto contestability really quickly, the slide had the headline from Netflix where it said sleep is our biggest competitor. There's an interesting kind of backstory to that. 2 weeks prior to that speech from Reed Hastings, I did a piece in Billboard magazine to introduce attention economics to the music industry. And the point I was making was if I binge watch Narcos, that's 10 episodes for 3 series, that's 30 hours, there's nothing else I can do with my time. Games loses, The Economist loses, music loses, Netflix has a monopoly on my time. So you're not competing with your competitors, you're competing with this scarce resource. And I sent it to my colleague at Netflix, and 2 weeks later he wrote back and said, hey, Reed responded to your article, link, sleep is our biggest competitor. In the bottom of the email he put, P.S. F you. So I wrote back to him and said, hey, it's really honoured that Reed Hastings has commented on my article and responded to it. And by the way, Spotify's got sleep music too, P.S. F you too.
Well, I was going to make a point about Netflix too, actually. So my charity has a trading arm, and we're doing some work with one of the bigger broadcasters. And over the years, I've worked for a lot of them. And I was stunned to hear that Netflix, even with some of the biggest rights holders in the country, refuses to share any data at all on usage of their platform, which strikes me as, on the one hand, a very defensive position in that they want to keep control of what they will spend on IP licensing. But on the other hand, what it doesn't do is free up that market to understand much, much more about their customers, about what they watch, about what they don't watch. And it just strikes me that there is a campaign to free up the data in many of these streaming media platforms that would help move the entire economy on.
Yep. And it may get, at the moment, the reason that happens is because Netflix gets more value from being able to get better deals for the content because it's hiding so much of the data than it does sharing that content with the ecosystem. At some stage, it may get to this stage where it realizes there is more value in selling that content onto content providers that will flick the switch for a fee. Great, okay, so thank you very much to the panel. We've got, okay.